Carter's shoulder crashed into the weathered door, sending it flying wide. Water erupted across honey-colored hardwood like a broken dam. The screaming pipes echoed through rooms that smelled of lavender and secrets. "Ma'am!" His voice cut through the chaos as his work boots carved wet trails across Persian rugs. "Emergency! Your main line just blew! This whole place is about to flood!" A sharp cry pierced the steamy air from behind frosted glass. Bare feet danced frantically on marble tiles. Then she appeared, golden hair streaming down porcelain shoulders, emerald eyes blazing above a hastily clutched towel. But those eyes didn't hold embarrassment or anger. They held the cold precision of someone who could end a life with 3 calculated moves. Carter's calloused hands trembled around his wrench as ice crawled up his spine. No small-town writer had eyes like that. The woman stepped backward, her grip tightening on the terry cloth like armor. Steam curled between them, carrying the scent of expensive soap and something metallic Carter couldn't place. Behind her, water continued its relentless assault on hardwood floors that probably cost more than his trailer. "Turn around," she commanded, voice steady despite her state of undress. "Please." Carter obeyed instantly, focusing on the wall of family photos that weren't there. No personal touches, no warmth, just blank walls and furniture that looked rented. "I'm Carter Hayes," he called over his shoulder. "Live in the trailer 50 yards that way. Been watching this place flood for the past 10 minutes. The sound of hurried movement filled the silence. Drawers opening, fabric rustling, bare feet padding across tile. "You can turn around now." When he did, she'd transformed into someone entirely different. Jeans and a grey sweater, damp hair pulled into a messy bun, face composed but guarded. Only her eyes remained the same, sharp, calculating, missing nothing. "I'm Vic," she said, extending a hand that felt surprisingly strong. "Thank you for this." She gestured at the growing puddle, spreading across her living room like spilled secrets. Carter knelt beside the main shut-off valve, muscles coiled with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. The pipe had split clean through, probably from the freeze they'd had 2 weeks back. "You're lucky I heard it," he said, cranking the valve closed. "Another hour and you'd have lost everything on this floor." Vic watched him work with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Most people looked away when he was elbow-deep in their plumbing problems, embarrassed by the mess or simply uninterested in the mechanics. But she studied every movement, every tool, cataloging information like she was preparing for an exam. "How long will it take to fix?" she asked. "Few hours, maybe more. Depends on what I find when I dig deeper." Carter glanced up to find her staring out the window toward his trailer, where Ruby's bicycle leaned against the makeshift porch. "You have a family," she observed. It wasn't a question. "Daughter, Ruby. She's 7. Something flickered across Vic's features, too quick to interpret, gone before he could analyze it. "Just the 2 of you?" Again, not really a question, more like confirmation of facts she already suspected. Carter nodded, suddenly aware of how little he knew about this woman who'd been living 50 yards away for the past 3 months. "What about you? You married?" The silence stretched too long, filled with the drip of water and unspoken secrets. "No," Vic said finally. "Work keeps me too busy for that sort of thing." Carter waited for her to elaborate, but she'd already turned away, surveying the damage with the detached assessment of someone evaluating a crime scene. "I should get my tools," he said, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Be back in 20 minutes. As he headed for the door, he caught her reflection in the darkened window, standing perfectly still, watching him leave with the patience of a predator. 3 months. Ruby had been asking about their mysterious neighbor for 3 months, and Carter had always told his daughter to respect people's privacy. Some folks needed space to heal, he'd explained, thinking of his own dark months after Linda's accident. But now, standing in Vic's sterile living room with water lapping at his boots, Carter wondered if privacy was the right word. The house felt less like a home and more like a carefully constructed stage set, beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of personality. When Carter returned with his toolbox, Ruby trailing behind despite his protests, Vic was waiting on the porch. She'd changed again, this time into clothes that actually fit, replacing the oversized sweater with a fitted black t-shirt that revealed lean muscles in her arms. "This is Ruby," Carter said, resting a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Ruby, this is our neighbor, Miss Vic." Ruby stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood, brown pigtails bouncing as she tilted her head to study the woman who'd been a mystery for so long. "Hi," Ruby said, offering a gap-toothed grin. "Are you really a writer?" Vic's composure cracked just slightly, a micro-expression of surprise that vanished almost instantly. "Yes," she replied carefully. "I write stories." Ruby's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "What kind of stories? I love stories. Daddy reads to me every night, but he's not very good at voices." Carter felt heat creep up his neck as Ruby continued her innocent interrogation. "Do you have kids? Are you married? Why don't you ever come outside during the day?" "Ruby," Carter warned gently, but Vic held up a hand. "It's okay." She crouched down to Ruby's eye level, and for the first time since Carter had burst through her door, her expression softened into something approaching genuine warmth. "I write about families," she said, and it sounded like the first completely honest thing she'd said all morning. "About what happens when people lose the ones they love most." Ruby's smile faltered, her 7-year-old mind processing words that cut too close to home. "Like when Mommy went to heaven?" Ruby asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Carter's chest tightened as Vic's carefully constructed mask slipped completely. Raw pain flashed across her features, the kind that spoke of personal experience with loss and separation. "Yes, sweetheart. Exactly like that." The moment stretched between them, connecting 3 broken people in ways that words couldn't capture. Then Vic stood abruptly, walls slamming back into place with almost audible force. The repair work took 4 hours instead of 2. Carter found himself moving slowly, unnecessarily thorough in his examination of joints and fittings that were perfectly fine. Ruby had claimed the kitchen table as her coloring headquarters, chattering away to Vic about school, friends, and the injustice of bedtimes while carefully staying within the lines of a complex fairy tale scene. Vic listened with an attention that seemed almost hungry, asking follow-up questions that drew out more details about Ruby's small world. "Mrs. Peterson says I'm getting too old for fairy tales," Ruby announced, selecting a purple crayon for the princess's dress. "But Daddy says stories are important no matter how old you get." She glanced up at Vic with earnest brown eyes. "What do you think?" Vic was quiet for so long that Carter looked up from his work, wrench suspended in mid-air. "I think," Vic said finally, "that the best stories help us understand the world, and sometimes they help us understand ourselves." Ruby nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. "That's why Daddy tells me stories about Mommy, so I won't forget her." Carter's hand stilled completely as his daughter continued, oblivious to the emotional minefield she was dancing through. "Mommy used to smell like flowers and make pancakes shaped like butterflies. She had yellow hair like yours, but not as pretty." The crayon in Vic's hand snapped in half. She stared down at the broken pieces like they'd personally betrayed her. "I'm sorry," Vic said, voice thick with an emotion Carter couldn't identify. I need to make some phone calls. Work stuff. She disappeared into what Carter assumed was a bedroom, leaving behind the faint sound of muffled conversation and Ruby's innocent questions about why grown-ups always had to work so much. Carter finished the repairs in contemplative silence, his mind churning with observations that didn't quite fit together into a coherent picture. When Vic returned 20 minutes later, she'd rebuilt her composure, but couldn't quite hide the tension around her eyes. "All fixed," Carter announced, gathering his tools. "Should hold for years, but keep an eye on the pressure gauge in your basement." Vic nodded, pulling out a checkbook with practiced efficiency. "What do I owe you?" Carter waved her off. "Neighbors don't charge neighbors. Besides, Ruby enjoyed the company." As if summoned by her name, Ruby bounced over with her finished coloring page. "I made this for you," she said, presenting Vic with the fairy tale princess, who now sported blonde hair and green eyes that looked remarkably familiar. "So you won't be lonely when you're writing your stories." Vic accepted the drawing like it was made of spun glass, her throat working soundlessly for several seconds before she managed, "Thank you, Ruby. This is beautiful." Carter herded his daughter toward the door, but Ruby's parting shot stopped him cold. "Miss Vic, why don't you have any pictures of your family?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Vic's smile became something carved from marble. "Some people prefer to keep their memories private, sweetheart." Ruby processed this with the brutal honesty of childhood. "That sounds really sad," she said simply, then skipped out the door toward home. The following Tuesday brought Ruby home from school with a fever and the kind of miserable congestion that made breathing an Olympic sport. Carter called in sick to the construction site, settling into the familiar routine of single-parenthood crisis management, lukewarm baths, endless cups of juice, and the delicate balance between comfort and medicine. By evening, Ruby's temperature had climbed to 103 degrees, high enough to send Carter into the controlled panic mode he'd mastered since Linda's death. The knock at his trailer door came at 8:30, soft enough that he almost missed it over Ruby's labored breathing. Vic stood on his makeshift porch holding a brown paper bag and wearing an expression of carefully controlled concern. "I saw your lights on late," she said by way of explanation. "Thought you might need this." The bag contained homemade chicken soup, still warm, along with a bottle of children's fever reducer and a box of herbal tea that smelled like comfort and healing. "You didn't have to," Carter began, but Vic cut him off with a shake of her head. "How is she?" The question came out rougher than intended, revealing depths of genuine worry that surprised them both. Carter stepped aside, allowing her into the cramped but clean space that he and Ruby called home. The trailer was a study in efficient living, every inch utilized, every surface bearing evidence of their shared life together. Photos of Linda smiled down from the walls, mixed with Ruby's artwork and Carter's collection of outdated repair manuals. Ruby lay curled on the tiny sofa, wrapped in a quilt that had belonged to her grandmother. Her normally bright eyes were glassy with fever, but she managed a weak smile when she saw Vic. "Hi," she croaked, voice rough as sandpaper. "I'm sick." Vic approached with the careful reverence of someone unaccustomed to children, settling onto the edge of the coffee table with practiced quiet. "I brought you soup," she said softly. "My grandmother's recipe. She used to make it for me when I was little and felt terrible. Did it make you feel better?" Ruby asked with the innocent faith of childhood in the power of adult solutions. Vic's smile contained memories of kitchens that smelled like love and hands that knew exactly how to chase away the monsters under the bed. "Every time," she promised, and Carter found himself believing her completely. Together, they coaxed Ruby through half a bowl of soup and the appropriate dose of medicine, working with the synchronized efficiency of a team that had been together for years instead of hours. As Ruby finally drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd managed all day, Vic lingered in the doorway of the makeshift bedroom, studying the collection of stuffed animals and chapter books that defined a 7-year-old's universe. "She's lucky to have you," she said quietly, words that carried the weight of personal experience. Carter finished tucking the quilt around his daughter's small form before responding. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough. If she needs more than just me stumbling through parenthood." "You're not stumbling," Vic said with quiet conviction. "You're loving her. That's the hardest part, and you're doing it perfectly." The compliment hit Carter squarely in the chest, validation from someone who seemed to understand the weight of responsibility that came with protecting the innocent. They moved back to the living area, settling into the comfortable exhaustion that follows a crisis successfully weathered. Vic cradled a cup of the herbal tea, inhaling steam that carried memories of her own childhood illnesses and the people who'd cared enough to chase them away. "You mentioned your grandmother," Carter said, settling onto the opposite end of the small sofa. "She sounds like she was special." Vic's fingers tightened around the ceramic mug, knuckles going white with tension that seemed disproportionate to such an innocent observation. "She raised me after my parents died," she said carefully, each word selected with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. "Car accident when I was 12. Grandmother Patterson took me in, taught me that family isn't always about blood." The revelation hung between them like a bridge, offering connection while maintaining careful distance. Carter recognized the strategy. Share enough truth to build trust while keeping the deeper secrets safely buried. He'd done the same thing in the months after Linda's death, answering well-meaning questions about his loss while never revealing the full extent of his struggle to keep breathing in a world that had suddenly lost its center. "I'm sorry," Carter said, meaning it completely. "Losing parents that young, I can't imagine." Vic shrugged with practiced nonchalance, but her eyes betrayed the 7-year-old girl who still lived somewhere deep inside, the one who'd learned too early that the people you love most can disappear without warning. "It was a long time ago. Grandmother Patterson made sure I turned out okay." The smile that accompanied her words was genuine, but edged with something that might have been regret. Over the next 2 weeks, Vic became a regular presence in their small orbit. She brought Ruby books when she was well enough to read, helped with homework that challenged Carter's rusty math skills, and somehow always appeared with exactly the right remedy when Ruby's recovery hit inevitable bumps. Her integration into their routine was so gradual, so natural, that Carter found himself forgetting to question the gift of her presence. Ruby, with the adaptability of childhood, simply accepted that Miss Vic had become part of their world. She chatted about school projects over dinner that Vic had helped prepare, sought Vic's opinion on important 7-year-old decisions, and began including their neighbor in the evening ritual of story time, with the casual assumption that all adults existed primarily to serve her entertainment needs. Carter watched this transformation with wonder and growing unease, recognizing the dangerous territory of attachment they were entering. The unease crystallized into something sharper the evening Ruby fell asleep between them on the sofa, her fever finally broken, small body relaxed in complete trust. Vic sat perfectly still, afraid to move and disturb the peace that had settled over the trailer like a benediction. In the lamplight, with Ruby's head pillowed on her lap, she looked nothing like the guarded woman who'd emerged from her bathroom 3 weeks earlier. She looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. "She's gotten attached to you," Carter said quietly, stating the obvious with the heavy awareness of potential consequences. Vic's hand had been unconsciously stroking Ruby's hair, but it stilled at his words. "I know," she replied, voice barely above a whisper. "I should probably pull back, give you space." The words sounded like they were being dragged from somewhere deep and painful, a necessary amputation of something precious but dangerous. Carter studied her profile in the soft light, noting the tension in her jaw, the careful control in her breathing. "Is that what you want?" he asked, surprised by his own boldness. Vic turned to meet his gaze directly for the first time all evening, and he saw something raw and desperate flickering in the green depths of her eyes. "What I want," she said carefully, "isn't always what's best for everyone involved." The statement carried layers of meaning that Carter couldn't quite decipher, but he recognized the sound of someone preparing for sacrifice. "Maybe let us decide what's best for us," he said gently, reaching across Ruby's sleeping form to cover Vic's hand with his own. Her fingers were cold despite the warm evening, trembling slightly with either fear or restraint. "Ruby's happy for the first time since Linda died. Hell, I'm happy for the first time in 2 years. Don't take that away because you think you're protecting us from something we might never need protection from." Vic looked down at their joined hands, at Ruby's peaceful face, at the accumulation of ordinary moments that had somehow added up to something extraordinary. When she looked back at Carter, her walls had crumbled just enough to reveal the woman beneath the careful construction, someone who wanted desperately to belong somewhere, to someone, to a life that felt real instead of carefully orchestrated. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, voice cracking slightly. "I don't know how to be part of a family." "Nobody does at first," Carter said with the hard-won wisdom of experience. "You just show up and love people the best way you know how. The rest sorts itself out." Ruby stirred slightly in her sleep, unconsciously tightening her grip on Vic's hand like she could sense the adult conversation happening above her head. The gesture seemed to settle something in Vic's chest, decision crystallizing into determination. "Okay," she said simply. "I'll try." The trying began with small gestures that gradually became larger ones. Vic learned Ruby's schedule, appeared with snacks that perfectly complemented homework frustrations, and somehow always knew exactly when Carter needed an extra pair of hands with the endless logistics of single parenthood. She helped Ruby practice reading, listened to detailed explanations of playground politics, and maintained the kind of interested engagement that made a 7-year-old feel important and heard. For Carter, Vic's presence meant conversations that extended beyond the basic requirements of childcare and household maintenance. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, shared carefully edited stories about her own professional challenges, and brought a perspective to their small world that felt both fresh and familiar. More importantly, she looked at him like he was someone worth knowing, not just Ruby's father, but a man with his own hopes and complications. The shift was so gradual that Carter didn't recognize it until Ruby articulated what he'd been feeling but couldn't name. "Daddy?" she announced over breakfast one morning, syrup dripping from her fork as she considered her next words carefully. "I think Miss Vic likes us." Carter paused in his review of the day's work schedule, coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. "What makes you say that, Bug?" Ruby's expression took on the earnest intensity she reserved for her most important observations. "She remembers things," Ruby explained with 7-year-old logic. "Like how I don't like the crusts on my sandwiches, and that you always forget to eat lunch when you're working on big projects. People only remember stuff like that when they care about you." The simple truth of his daughter's observation hit Carter with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on the mystery of who Vic was that he'd missed the more important question of what she was becoming. To Ruby, to him, to their carefully reconstructed world. That evening, after Ruby had been tucked into bed with the appropriate number of stories and glasses of water, Carter found Vic on his porch steps, staring up at a sky full of stars that were visible only because they lived far enough from the city lights to see them clearly. She'd been quieter than usual during dinner, present but somehow distant, as if part of her mind was occupied with problems he couldn't see. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her on the wooden steps that he'd been meaning to repair for the past 6 months. Vic turned toward him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just thinking about work stuff, deadlines and complications. The pause before complications carried weight that made Carter's instincts prickle with unease. In the 3 weeks since the pipe incident, Vic had shared carefully selected details about her writing career, but something about her explanations never quite aligned with his limited understanding of how authors actually lived and worked. "Must be pretty demanding work," he said carefully, testing the waters. "You're up late a lot of nights." "Research," Vic said quickly. "I do a lot of research." The explanation felt rehearsed, polished smooth by repetition. Carter nodded as if it made complete sense, but filed the observation away with the growing collection of small inconsistencies that surrounded their mysterious neighbor. She never seemed to actually write anything, despite claiming to be on deadline. Her house remained starkly impersonal despite 3 months of residence. And then there were her eyes, always watchful, always calculating, missing nothing, and revealing even less. "What kind of stories do you write exactly?" Carter asked, genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been concern. Vic went very still beside him, and he could practically feel her mind working through potential responses. "Crime stories," she said finally, "about families affected by criminal activity. It requires a lot of background research into police procedures, legal process, that sort of thing." The explanation was smooth, logical, and utterly unconvincing in ways that Carter couldn't articulate. Before he could probe deeper, Ruby's voice drifted through the screen door, calling for water and additional tucking-in services. Carter rose to handle the request, but Vic was already on her feet. "I'll get it," she said, disappearing into the trailer with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. Carter remained on the porch, staring up at stars that suddenly seemed farther away than usual, wrestling with the growing certainty that the woman currently reading his daughter a bedtime story was not who she claimed to be. The realization should have terrified him, should have sent him charging inside to protect Ruby from whatever danger Vic might represent. Instead, he found himself thinking about the gentleness in her voice when she spoke to his daughter, the careful way she moved through their space, the profound sadness that sometimes flickered across her features when she thought no one was looking. Whatever secrets Vic was carrying, whatever her real story might be, Carter was increasingly certain that she posed no threat to the people she'd somehow learned to love. When Vic emerged from the trailer 15 minutes later, Ruby was presumably asleep, and the evening had settled into the comfortable quiet that surrounded their small corner of the world. She paused beside Carter's chair, and he could sense her internal debate before she spoke. "Carter," she said carefully, "if you ever found out that someone you cared about wasn't exactly who you thought they were, would that change how you felt about them?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and unspoken fears. Carter considered his response carefully, recognizing that they were approaching something important and fragile. "Depends," he said finally. "Are we talking about someone who lied to hurt people, or someone who lied to protect them?" Vic's breath caught audibly, and when he looked up at her, her composure was hanging by threads. What if the lies were necessary but still caused pain? What if someone's real job required them to be someone else, even when they didn't want to be? The pieces clicked together with almost audible force. The careful responses, the empty house, the eyes that missed nothing, the late nights and early mornings. Carter felt something cold settle in his stomach as understanding dawned. "Vic," he said quietly, "what do you really do for a living?" She stared down at him for a long moment, and he watched her make a decision that would change everything between them forever. "I'm FBI," she said simply, words dropping like stones into still water. Agent Victoria Sterling. I've been undercover for 3 months, investigating a money laundering operation that runs through local real estate transactions. Carter's world tilted sideways as the woman he'd been falling for revealed herself to be someone else entirely. The writing thing was just cover. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would have admitted what they both knew to be true. Carter stood slowly, mind reeling through every conversation, every moment of connection, every time Ruby had looked at Vic with the trusting adoration of a child who'd found another adult worth loving. How much of it was real? He asked, voice carefully controlled. How much of the woman my daughter is attached to actually exists? Vic's face crumpled slightly, the professional mask finally slipping completely away. All of it, she said desperately. The way I feel about Ruby, about you, about this life we've been building, that's the most real thing I've experienced in years. But you'll leave, Carter said, not a question but a statement of inevitable fact. When your case is over, you'll disappear back to whatever life you had before, and Ruby will be left wondering why another person she loved decided she wasn't worth staying for. The words hit Vic like physical blows, each one driving home the magnitude of what she'd done by allowing herself to care, by allowing them to care in return. I don't want to leave, Vic said, voice breaking. But I don't know how to stay. This isn't my life, Carter. This is borrowed time. Carter looked at her standing in the lamplight of his porch, hair mussed from Ruby's bedtime routine, wearing one of his old sweaters because she'd gotten cold, looking more like home than anything had in 2 years. Maybe it could be, he said quietly. Maybe some things are worth changing your life for. Before Vic could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching at high speed cut through the evening quiet. Multiple engines, moving fast, heading directly for their small corner of the world. Vic's entire body went rigid with recognition and terror. Oh God, she whispered, hand moving instinctively toward a weapon that wasn't there. They found me. Carter, get Ruby, now! The command came out in the clipped professional tone of someone accustomed to life or death decisions, all pretense of ordinary neighborly concern stripped away. Carter was moving before his conscious mind caught up, muscle memory from 2 years of single parenthood overriding confusion and fear. He burst through the screen door as 3 black SUVs screamed to a stop in front of Vic's house, their headlights painting the quiet street in harsh, unforgiving light. Behind him, Vic was speaking rapidly into a cell phone he'd never seen her use, her voice carrying the authority of someone calling in federal backup to a situation that had spiraled beyond control. Ruby sat up in bed, rubbing sleep from her eyes as Carter scooped her into his arms. Daddy? What's happening? Are we going somewhere? Her voice held the confused trust of a child who'd never had reason to doubt that the adults in her life could handle whatever problems arose. Carter's heart broke a little as he realized he was about to shatter that trust forever. We need to go to the back of the trailer, Bug. Right now. He carried her toward the rear bedroom, away from windows that might become targets. Stay down, Vic commanded, appearing beside them with a gun that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Ruby's eyes went wide with fear and confusion as the woman who'd been reading her bedtime stories 5 minutes earlier transformed into someone else entirely. Daddy, why does Miss Vic have a gun? Ruby's voice climbed toward panic as the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the night air. Carter crouched beside his daughter, using his body to shield her from windows and unknown threats, while his mind struggled to process the surreal turn their quiet evening had taken. Ruby, listen to me, Carter said, forcing calm into his voice despite the chaos erupting outside. Miss Vic is a police officer, a really important one, and right now she's trying to protect us from some bad people. But we need to be very quiet and do exactly what she tells us, okay? Ruby nodded solemnly, the gravity of the situation penetrating her 7-year-old understanding, even if the details remained beyond her comprehension. Vic was at the window, peering through curtains at the scene unfolding across the street. "They're not federal," she said grimly, professional assessment overriding personal fear. "This is the money laundering operation. They've made me as FBI, and they're here to clean up loose ends." She turned back to Carter and Ruby, and her expression carried the weight of someone calculating odds that didn't look favorable, including anyone who might have seen something they shouldn't have. The implication hit Carter like ice water. By involving himself in Vic's life, by allowing Ruby to grow attached, he'd painted a target on his daughter's back. "What do we do?" he asked, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Vic's response was interrupted by the sound of glass breaking from the direction of her house, followed by shouting in languages Carter didn't recognize. "Back door," Vic said decisively. "There's a trail through the woods behind your property that leads to the main road. My backup is en route, but we need to keep you safe until they arrive." They moved through Carter's trailer like ghosts, avoiding windows and keeping low. Ruby clung to her father's neck, her small body tense with fear, but trusting him to navigate whatever nightmare had invaded their peaceful world. At the back door, Vic paused, checking her weapon with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom violence was a professional tool rather than a last resort. "Once we're outside, no talking," she instructed. "The woods will provide cover, but sound carries at night." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of pine needles and shadows, of Ruby's weight in Carter's arms, and Vic's silent form leading them along paths he'd never known existed. Behind them, the sound of their home being systematically destroyed grew fainter, but never disappeared entirely. Carter found himself thinking about photo albums and Ruby's artwork, about the quilt that had belonged to Linda's mother, and the collection of repair manuals he'd never get to finish reading. They reached the main road just as the first federal vehicles came screaming around the bend, sirens wailing and emergency lights painting the darkness in strobing red and blue. Vic stepped into the roadway with the confidence of someone who knew exactly which side the cavalry was on, badge held high and voice carrying the authority that came with years of training. "Agent Sterling, FBI, I have civilians in need of protection." The next few hours passed in a controlled chaos of debriefings and evidence collection, of paramedics checking Ruby for shock, and federal agents asking Carter the same questions in slightly different ways. Ruby fell asleep in his arms sometime after midnight, exhausted by events beyond her understanding, trusting that the adults would somehow make sense of the madness and restore order to her small world. When the immediate crisis had passed and the criminals were in custody, Carter found Vic standing alone beside an ambulance, staring back toward the woods they'd escaped through. She'd changed again, back into the professional agent he'd glimpsed during their flight, competent and controlled, and somehow more distant than the woman who'd helped Ruby with her homework just hours earlier. "Is it over?" Carter asked, settling Ruby more comfortably in his arms. "The case is closed," Vic replied without turning around. "The money laundering operation has been shut down, the main players are in custody, and the threat has been neutralized." Her tone was clinical, professional, completely devoid of the warmth that had characterized their conversations over the past few weeks. Carter recognized the deliberate distance, the careful construction of walls that had been temporarily lowered, but were now being rebuilt with reinforced determination. "What happens now?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Vic finally turned to face him, and he saw that Victoria Sterling, FBI agent, had completely replaced Vic the neighbor, Vic the surrogate family member, Vic the woman who'd looked at him like he was worth staying for. "Now I go back to my real life," she said quietly. "And you go back to yours. What happened here?" It can't happen again. I put you and Ruby in danger by letting my personal feelings compromise my professional judgment. Carter wanted to argue, wanted to point out that what had developed between them was worth fighting for, worth changing career paths and life plans and carefully constructed professional barriers. But Ruby stirred in his arms, mumbling about bad dreams and asking for water, and he realized that his daughter's safety and stability had to come first. "Will we see you again?" he asked, though he already knew that answer too. "It's better if you don't," Vic replied, and Carter heard the sound of a door closing, of a chapter ending, of a woman choosing duty over desire with the kind of finality that brooked no argument. "Take care of her, Carter. She's lucky to have you." The words were meant as comfort, but they felt like goodbye, like the end of something that had barely had time to begin, but had felt more real than anything either of them had experienced in years. 6 months later, Carter stood in his rebuilt kitchen, watching Ruby practice reading at the table they'd salvaged from the wreckage of that night. The insurance money had covered most of the damage, and the federal government had quietly taken care of the rest, along with the relocation offer that Carter had politely declined. This was their home, their community, their life, and he wasn't going to let fear drive them away from the place where they'd learned to be happy again. Ruby had adjusted to Vic's disappearance with the resilience of childhood, though she still occasionally asked when Miss Vic was coming back to help with homework or read bedtime stories. Carter had learned to redirect those conversations toward the present, toward the friends and neighbors and extended community that formed their real support network, toward the future they were building together one ordinary day at a time. The knock at the door came on a Tuesday evening in March, soft and hesitant, almost lost beneath the sound of Ruby's laughter at something she'd read in her chapter book. Carter opened the door to find Vic standing on his porch, looking nervous and uncertain and somehow smaller than he remembered. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a simple sweater, and her hair was longer, softer, framing a face that looked more open than it had during their intense weeks together. "Hi," she said simply, and Carter felt something in his chest that had been carefully locked away begin to stir back to life. "I know I said it was better if you didn't see me again, but—" She paused, looking past him toward the sound of Ruby's voice, toward the warm light spilling from windows that had been carefully repaired and restored. "I was wrong about a lot of things, and I was hoping maybe you'd let me try to make some of them right." Carter stepped aside, allowing her into the space that had been rebuilt, but somehow never quite felt complete without her presence to anchor it. Ruby looked up from her book, eyes widening with recognition and joy, and the kind of uncomplicated happiness that only children could manage. "Miss Vic!" she cried, launching herself across the room and into arms that caught her with the desperate relief of someone reclaiming something precious they'd thought was lost forever. "I requested a transfer," Vic explained over Ruby's head, meeting Carter's eyes with a vulnerability that she'd never allowed herself to show before. "To the regional office. It means I can stay, if you'll have me. If you think there might be room in your life for someone who's finally figured out what home feels like." Carter looked at Ruby, secure and happy in Vic's embrace, and felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble into dust. "There's always been room," he said quietly, reaching out to complete the circle of connection that had been broken 6 months earlier, but had never truly been destroyed. "We've just been waiting for you to come home." Vic's smile was radiant, transformative, the expression of someone who'd finally learned that some things were worth changing your entire life to keep. Outside, the sun was setting over their small corner of the world, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility, illuminating a future that suddenly looked exactly like the family they'd all been searching for without knowing they were looking. Ruby pulled back from the embrace just enough to study Vic's face with the serious intensity of a 7-year-old conducting important business. "Are you staying this time?" she asked with the directness that only children could manage. "For real staying, not just visiting staying." Vic looked from Ruby to Carter, seeing acceptance and hope, and the kind of love that didn't require explanations or justifications, just presence and commitment and the willingness to build something lasting together. "For real staying," Vic promised, and Carter knew that this time she meant it completely.